So
Yeah.
if I'm in that situation, I'm a farmer and I could use some seasonal work. What considerations do I need to have in mind before I go down this road of an H-2A?
Yeah. I would say the number one, so if you're on H-2A, the number one certainly is that you can prove, in either contracts or in sort of just the management of your business. Maybe it's with weather, but you could truly prove the seasonality. So, for example, most of ag falls under this just well. Dairies, for example, they have a hard time using the program because it's really hard to show seasonality if you're milking, dairy cows year round. Mushroom farms are another one. That's tough. You're kind of growing those things year round in controlled environment. But nurseries, vineyards, apple operations, all that, as you said, in agriculture is pretty easy to show seasonality. So you've got to be able to prove seasonality. The second piece, or another big piece, is that housing. For H-2A, the employer is on the hook for supplying housing that has to meet state requirements. And the inspection's pretty thorough. There's a lot of, we make jokes about it. Some of the nuance in this housing is kind of wild. Certain instructions on the kind of screens you need to have on the windows and lids on trash cans, and can't have eggs on the counter. And a couple, generally just the more general stuff that you'd expect around, sufficient airflow and housing and spacing, the things you'd want in any good housing for guest workers coming to the United States. But that ends up being the biggest bottleneck for employers who want to navigate this is, you've got to have readily available housing. And in rural areas throughout the United States, that becomes harder and harder to find for a lot of these businesses. Those, I'd say, are the really two big things. There's a whole host of other additional regulations and investment the client has to take on to be able to leverage and utilize these workers. That gets increasingly complicated, which is where we come in and help clients navigate this. But those two, seasonality and the ability to provide housing, are big ones. One last one I'll add in there is, you also want to make this attractive to the worker. You want the worker to be able to come back. They control the visa. If the worker wants to leave, they can leave. So you have to have a sufficient amount of hours such that the worker actually, there's regulations around the minimum number of hours, but you have to have a sufficient amount of hours that's attractive for the worker to actually, leave their family for 8 to 10 months and come into the United States to actually do this work. So that's another big criteria as well.
And once they're here and they're working, do I pay them as I would any other employee as far as payroll, or are there extra considerations, kind of red tape I need to go through to make sure that that's all, tracked by the government and above board?
Yeah. So by and large, you're going to treat them, exactly the same as domestic worker. And in terms of, they're even paying into, Social Security, which is odd, but, just in a lot of ways. But yeah. So they're paying taxes. You're going to a normal employee. There are certainly some pretty nuanced differences in terms of, like, for example, what you have to show on payroll and how you communicate certain things. For example, on payroll for H-2A workers, because they're required a certain number of hours to be offered to them, you actually have to list how many hours were offered to the employer, which is kind of an odd thing to do if you think about, if you're an hourly employee working at McDonald's or something, it's likely not going to say on your paycheck, hey, we offered this employee 60 hours. They only wanted 40, so we paid it 40. It's like, no, they paid for 40, we paid 40. Here you have to, hours offered is one small nuance. And there's a host of additional other requirements, but by and large, the idea is you need to treat them the same as the domestic worker. The flip side of this is that you need to treat them the same as a domestic worker. So if there's an American worker doing the same exact job as this H-2A worker, but maybe the domestic worker is paid a little bit less, they actually need to be paid at the same wage as the H-2A worker. And so there is, a couple of additional regulations that, companies need to kind of apply to their hiring and employment practices that, again, we help folks through that are additional considerations as they look at this program.
Yeah. Well, if I'm obviously I have a seasonal need for labor, for help. I've kind of, got you working on all my compliance. So I have the housing and I'm going to pay to bring them there. And then I have to pay them the same as somebody else. Don't I start to run into the situation of like, man, maybe I could just afford someone year round full time for the same cost, because I wouldn't have to provide housing or transportation. I mean, is that a constant sort of calculation between the two? Does it run close, or is it a matter of like, you just literally can't find the person?
That is a great question. And I can tell you, anecdotally, and I actually visited a client this morning, during different parts of the year, but different teams in the company will go out and just visit clients, see how they're doing, ask questions. And so we visited a local client here about 30, 40 minutes outside of Charlottesville, Virginia, nursery grower with about 80 workers now, been in the program for 5 or 6 years. And, very savvy operation. And, and they're sophisticated, they're running different business models. And, some instances they're a price taker, they're a sophisticated operation. And the way they think about it, and what the individual told me their CFO said, look, the H-2A worker, one, we can't find American workers who want to do this work. Two, a lot of the work in their instances is actually pretty seasonal. And so this part of the year, we're like, we don't actually need that many staff. But the bigger piece was, he said, look, the H-2A worker that's here, they are 3 times more productive in terms of their output and what they do. And so, and I asked him, well, how do you measure this? And he said, well, look, we have records of, throughput on the particular mechanism they have, which is similar to a kind of a potting of plant. And we could see throughput. And sure enough, these guys are 3 times more productive. And so undoubtedly, this individual in particular, they can't find domestic labor that's reliable, that's going to show up. Number one. Number two, they're seasonal. So they don't need as many of the, in this case, they needed 80 seasonal workers. They definitely don't need that many full-time, year-round workers. But 3, to find 3x the productivity of these workers, even with the investments in their housing and maybe higher wages, food, it becomes a huge, these guys are not missing work. They're coming up to work. They're here to work, good attitudes, low drama. The ROI becomes pretty clear for them, where it's it's not even an if anymore. It's like, nope, we want these guys. And because they're so reliable, and this is such a great opportunity for those workers, for this client in particular, and across the board, is that they're highly incentivized to come back year after year, which means every year it saves the company on having to retrain. And so we've had one of our clients talk about this as the come to Jesus moment. Guys get off the bus. Year 1, they're nervous. And we spend a lot more time with those clients in year 1. But year 2, guys get off the bus, they put their bags in the barracks, and they know exactly where to go. And they can just get to work. They want to work. They're happy to be there. It's not easy work by any means, but the opportunity is so big for them that they're willing to really dig in.
And they call it that because that's when they realize, like, oh, that's when they see the light. Like, oh, this is really, this is really more than just finding, a warm body to do a job. I'm actually bringing in someone with, not just productivity, but a skill set to actually help me in my business. Is that right?
That's exactly right. Yeah, to close the thought on that, that's the come to Jesus moment. Really, is that year 2 when these guys get off the bus and it's like they can just get right to work. And this is a different client that told me this story, but for him, it's like he decided this 20 years ago, and every single year he's been using labor to the point where he's got grandchildren that are now coming from Mexico to his operation from the original, guys who came 20 years ago. And what an opportunity for that whole family, and the money they get to take back to Mexico or Guatemala or elsewhere. So, but certainly, no doubt, the program is expensive for a lot of people, and for some, it certainly is they will be costed out of the program for better, for worse, for sure. But for a lot of folks, the lack of domestic labor is so lacking that the ROI is pretty high.
Right. I have heard stories of farmers complying with H-2A, but not able to get workers. So what types of factors, either internal or external, can impact this process? I'm thinking things like politics getting in the way. Give us a sense of like when this goes off the rails and what can happen, so that people understand some of the risks associated here.
Yeah, so I'd say some of the risks. I'm happy to take the politics one aside, because I think politics itself is an interesting challenge in the H2, but I would say not a challenge that actually, not, knock on wood, it hasn't been a prohibitive challenge to clients using this. Now, it can make it harder and it can make it more difficult. I'm happy to dive into that. I think ways people can sort of off-ramp themselves in the program. Obviously, number one is any history of worker abuse. And we stand by that. And when we hear stuff, if there's any kind of worker abuse or worker maltreatment, we don't want anything to do with those clients, frankly. The market's big enough that we don't have to take that kind of it. Thankfully, it's far and few in between. But that's number one. I think number two is if you don't have housing or sufficient housing. Clients can get through the process, get the filing and documentation they need, but if they can't get past that housing milestone, it's just not going to work for them. I'd say the third is, the kind of core tenet around seasonality. So, businesses in the United States today, given the labor market, are desperate. They're absolutely desperate for reliable, legal, capable labor. So there are some businesses that are, if you look at it on the surface, you're like, well, you're manufacturing, some sort of something. There is no way you're seasonal on the surface. And so you really have got to make a pretty creative argument to get in there. And sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. But if they get far enough, and we find this some of our, some more unscrupulous competitors is convincing people that they are seasonal when they're not, that the agent gets paid and the client finds out later on, no, there's no way you're going to get to this program. So we do a lot of work on the front end to make sure that if we're bringing somebody in the door, we want to make sure they've got the seasonality, they check the boxes to actually be eligible for the program. But seasonality, housing, and then kind of worker history are three ways that you get off ramp to this program pretty easy. If you're clearly trying to skirt the regulations, you can also be debarred from the program and suspended for a couple of years. And this does happen. Yeah.
But what about my blueberries need to get picked today. They're ready.
Yeah.
I've done the H-2A stuff and I just can't get them here in time. Do people run into that? I feel like I've heard stories like that.
I see. Oh, yeah. I understand. So not even just about getting the visas, but what we talk about is kind of our ROT score, like the right worker on time. Like how do you get guys here on time? Yeah. So this happens. This undoubtedly happens and it happened this last year. Actually, in fact, the U.S. consulate in Monterey, which don't quote me on this, but I'm pretty sure the U.S. consulate in Monterey is the busiest consulate in the world in the sense that they are processing hundreds of thousands of H-2 visas there, all in a very short amount of time. A vast majority of these workers are crossing in, early spring, late winter when, crops are starting to be planted and so forth. So super busy consulate. And last year they just could not process quick enough. So you have to schedule, and our part of our job for clients is we'll schedule appointments for them at the U.S. consulate. And we couldn't get enough people in as all of a sudden us and a whole host of other companies were, flying workers to Guadalajara and Tijuana and Oaxaca and just and Matamoros, just trying to get workers to any consulate that had availability of appointments. And it was sort of a mad dash. And that caused delays. That caused serious delays, which for a lot of companies can cause serious pain. If you've got a crop that needs to move or be put in the ground or harvested and you wait in 2 weeks or a week because workers are stuck in Monterrey, Mexico, because there's not enough staff in your consulate, talk about a pretty painful experience that drives some of our clients to, what, I'm gonna go to Mexico myself and figure out what's going on. And of course, those solutions don't always bear fruit, but it can be very frustrating. So this does happen. I'd say by and large, we're proud about the record we have on being able to move workers through and the effort we can take to actually make that happen and the partners we have on the ground. But it's an area, I'd say, for the industry that needs work. But how do we provide more predictability about, especially when we're down to the 11th hour and those workers are about to cross? We want to provide clients, very accurate understanding of the timeline of, okay, the workers in Monterey today, tomorrow they're going to be processed. Third day, they're going to get on a bus. They should be at your location and your job site by Sunday, so you can have them start by Monday. And I think getting that more specific is a move the whole industry is making, and in an area we're working pretty hard to use technology to help us do that. But we've made some moves. For example, the buses that transfer our workers up from Mexico, they've got GPS tracking, so you can send the link to the client and they can see exactly where that bus is, when it's stopping for food, and so forth. But undoubtedly, we're moving, 50 to 60,000 workers a year. Delays happen. They undoubtedly happen.
Yeah. Boy, 50 to 60,000 seems like a lot. And this might be a naive question, but I just don't know. You mentioned earlier the overwhelming demand for labor in agriculture and the need for help. Are there sufficient numbers of people who want to do this, in these countries, Mexico, Guadalajara, El Salvador, some of the ones you mentioned, to where we can get, you mentioned the right labor on time? Are there sufficient numbers on that side of things?
Yeah, I would say, that on the list of concerns of mine, I would say, knock on wood, that one is pretty low. I think, and part of it is just the economics. We've got some stories of, so for example, Washington State, if you're picking apples up in Washington State, I feel for those growers because the adverse effect wage rate up there is very high. And so, but if you're coming from Mexico, picking apples in Washington State for 10 months, you're looking at 12 to 20 times your annual income. If I told you can make 20 times your income doing the same job up in Canada, you might consider, making a move for 10 months of the year. And so the economics are really high. And so, which makes it such that people, even younger generations in Mexico and elsewhere, still see H2 opportunities as viable golden ticket opportunities. Now, there certainly is a movement, and we encourage our clients as well to do this, to say, look, the demographics in Mexico are such that there probably is a bit less of younger population workers wanting to come take H2 visas because there's more opportunity where they're at. Okay. And so it's probably a good idea of long haul to diversify your workforce. Let's start pulling workers from Guatemala and El Salvador. We've got a younger population base, maybe a little bit less opportunity you might find from workers out of Monterrey or Mexico City or rural Mexico even. And then let's just start to diversify it a little bit. And that'll help you. For some reason, if there's, less workers willing to take these jobs in Mexico, which is unforeseen, that then you have kind of a more diversity. Now, I'd still say by and large, there's still a lot of workers who want these visas, and for good reasons. But I can give you one example where the trend is turning a little bit differently, which is around CDL drivers, so commercial drivers. There's such, this is anecdotally, I don't have the data on it. There's such high demand for CDL drivers for H-2A visas, moving nursery products or picked product, from between farms and so forth. There's such high demand for those folks to come drive in the United States. And there's a reciprocity agreement between Mexico and the United States and Canada that if you have a CDL in one country, you can drive in another country. That actually, there's so much demand pulling these workers from Mexico, that actually Mexico apparently is bringing in Guatemalans to come. They actually have a shortage of truck drivers as well in Mexico because so many of these folks being pulled into the United States. And so what's happening in some instances is that the Mexican wages for these workers are also going up. But a lot of those workers are saying, well, I have a 12-month job at this wage in Mexico. I don't have to leave my family. Or a pretty much closer wage, a pretty similar wage in the United States for 10 months. So I do have to leave my family. I'm going to stay put in Mexico, which then can be problematic for those in the United States who then have to raise wages a little bit. But so that's, I think as you get more specialized, a risk will be that we can't find enough talent with that specific skill set. And then the market forces around wages start to show up. I only see it in truck drivers today. But, I can dive into how I think that'll play out. But by and large, there's still a large population of workers in Central and South America who want to come to the United States.
Sure. Well, that's, yeah, because it does seem like there's certainly a shortage of labor to operate, at least in agriculture, to kind of get everything done. And it does seem like a good program. Anything else on the H2 process that really a farmer who's considering it would need to know, especially anything that might, anything that might surprise someone who might be looking at this as an option?
Yeah, I think speaking from the perspective of a former farm boy who my brothers and I, one of 6 kids, we were farm labor growing up on my farm. Is you've got especially our farm operation. My parents also had full-time jobs, and they were entrepreneurs in their own rights, and things just got busy. So it was really easy for things to fall behind. And so I say that because people we're working with these are business owners and family people, and they've got a whole bunch of stuff to do. And so planning really matters. So I'd say for us, we need at the best ideal lead time is about 120 days before you need workers to show up, get in contact with us. But if you had to push it all the way down to 45 days, you hate to do that. It doesn't always work. You run a big risk of delayed workers, but we could work with as little as 60 to 45 days. But, 4 months or about a quarter before you need those workers, that's when you want to get in contact with us to get you set up. I'd say the second piece is, and this isn't true for a lot of our competitors, but we really think about ourselves as river guides. And so when you work with másLabor, you get a case manager. Not only you get a case manager, you also get an operations coordinator. So you got a filing strategist, and you've got your worker coordination strategist. That team together is you've got a mighty team of consultants there that get to know your business really, really well and are available to you, all the time. And they're your river guide. So it's not like you fill this out and it's like, all right, good luck. We'll see you in 4 months and we're going to show up at 5 o'clock. Like, no. We're holding your hand through this whole thing. And that is a huge differentiator for us.